Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you're listening to this. This is episode 10, believe it or not, of the StromCast. And today we've got someone outside of our normal circle. We've got an academic, I believe is a technical term, Dr. Christopher Matthews from Nottingham Trent University, PhD in sociology. And Dr. Matthews is going to talk to us today around why we do, or athletes do, the stupid things they do, roughly, approximately.
Yeah.
And on that note, I'll hand over to Dr. Matthews to introduce himself.
Yeah, I like that that notion of why we do the things we do. I've never put it like that. I'd put it slightly differently, but I think we can stick with that for now, for sure. Yeah, so I'm Christopher Matthews. I think it's worth, because I'm so far out of everybody's kind of circle of this sort of area, just introducing my background a little bit, and that will lead us into understanding a little bit about why we would bother with sociology. So my kind of interaction with gym culture started when I was 15. So 25 years, I was thinking about that this morning, quarter of a century in the gym. I may not look like I've been in the gym for a quarter of a century, but in and out in terms of bodybuilding gyms, proper weightlifting gyms while I was at Loughborough, boxing gyms where I spent a lot of work time for my research, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then more recently, as I've had to stop boxing as I've got a bit older and had a few brain problems, my dog wants to go out, damn it. Just normal gyms, back into normal gyms, which is quite cool as well. So I've spent a load of time in gyms. I've actually never really published specifically about gyms, but we're going to talk a lot about that today. I use a lot of the examples that I've had over those years in teaching. So that's where I kind of like come into this, as you talked about it, the sociology of strength sports.
Yeah.
Sociology of drugs is what we're going to talk about as well. Sociology of bodybuilding and those sort of things. So I think that's where we'll go. Just a quick bit on my education. I don't know if you ever knew this, I was a personal trainer for a while.
Didn't know that.
How I got into academia was I was a sports coach. Then I realized sports coaching is rubbish. So I did personal training. Then I realized personal training is rubbish. All of it's service industry, isn't it? So I went and did a personal training qualification. That led me into a HND. That led me to get into Loughborough to do sports science. Did sports science. We'll maybe talk about degrees as well in a little bit. I think I mentioned I might try and talk to you about that a bit, about why sports science is still a good degree when everyone else can self-educate, but we'll talk about that. And then I did sociology of sport masters, PhD in sociology, basically. Yeah. That was all around boxing. So I took up boxing at that time. I boxed for a little bit, very, very low level. There's my dog, she's pissed off because I'm not let her out. Very, very low level boxing. Boxed for about 10 years, and then eventually in and out of different boxing gyms, moved around, went to University of Brighton for my first proper academic post, and took up amateur boxing and had 3 fights.
Yeah.
Won my last one. That means I lost 2. So basically what I've done is built a career around studying what I think is the best stuff in sport, which is all the cool stuff: violence, pain and injury, drug use, all the stuff that I think is the stuff that, for me anyway, I mean, I like watching fight sports. I like watching people be big, fast and horrible to each other. I quite like that. I understand there's problems with that, but that's it's a little bit of my background. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to let your dog out, we can edit that out. That's not a problem.
I like it when dogs are in podcasts.
Yeah, well, the thing is, if we don't let the dog out, people will be sat there going, when's he going to let the dog out?
She's all right. I was going to talk as well about how we're thinking about sociology. Do you want me to just kind of move into that, how we're thinking about sociology here?
I was just going to say that the reason we've got Dr. Matthews on, and the reason it's a little bit different from normal, is that although Dr. Matthews very much is in academia as his day-to-day job, he works at Nottingham Trent University, he's a lot closer to one of us than you might think from just listening to the podcast. So we normally just put these out on audio. It will go out on video at some point, but he's covered in tattoos. He likes to drink. He's not what you normally expect, which is why I ended up chatting to him a while ago and kind of building this conversation. The other thing, if I can just ask, if you can just make sure your microphone isn't scraping on your beard when you're talking.
Oh. Because
we get an itchy, scratchy.
Can you hear that, can you?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, God damn, sorry. I'm an unprofessional. Because we're doing a lot of teaching from home now, I am going to have to follow your lead and set up a proper setup.
Get a grown-up microphone, yeah.
Yeah, I've got to do it, unfortunately. Well, not unfortunately. Professionalising is quite useful. Yes.
So, yeah,
So,
what do you mean by that term sociology?
yeah, so there's hundreds of years of debate around what that term means. Forget all of that. How are we going to think about it just for today? Very simply, that instead of thinking about how we can, as you put it, understand the stupid things that we do, using, let's say, biology, it's something to do with our genes, or psychology, it's something to do with like some sort of coherent identity that's solid in our heads that makes us do these things. We'll think about it more, and not that there isn't some validity in those ideas, obviously, but we'll think about it more in terms of how behaviors, ideas, people's identities and what they think about the world emerges out of interactions with each other, and also cultural norms and culture more broadly. So those sort of interactions, and you'll see that kind of underpins all the stuff that we'll talk about, are how people come to have behaviors. The simple way of thinking about it is the nurture, not the nature. That's the other way to think about it. So people learning stuff about how to be in the world and what's normal and what's not normal, and then how that behavior, those ideas shape their behaviors. So to simplify, that's the way we'll think about stuff.
So kind of a hot topic at the moment then.
In what respect?
With the current nonsense of the world.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with sociology is we all live in it, and it's constant. We all know something about sociology. We don't necessarily understand the science of it, but it can speak to every single topic. And one of the reasons why we've ended up talking about this, I think, is because although I've not specifically published on bodybuilding, I expect I will at some point. A lot of the stuff that we talk about using social theory and kind of social concepts that focus on social interactions help us to understand anything you want to apply them to. Now, understanding might be weaker in different places, but they're very, very useful tools and just really useful for critical thinking. So that will be kind of where we're kind of going to go with a lot of this stuff, I guess. And yes, it really does help with coronavirus. Not that anybody listens to sociologists, but they listen to epidemiologists. And we know there's a lot of problems with epidemiology. And there's a if anybody wants to follow one of my mentors, Robert Dingwall, on Twitter, I know no one goes on Twitter, but if he wants to know about coronavirus, he's the man to follow as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, sidetracked already.
Yeah. So we've actually got talking points.
Yes.
And the first point that we're going to stop off on our somewhat unusual journey today is labeling and subculture theory, and how that relates to bodybuilding and drugs.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm not going to belabor any of the theory, and I'm going to bunch these two ideas together relatively simply. And also, what hopefully people will find is that what I'm talking about, it's not anything that anyone's going to be like, oh, I never thought of it like that. They'll know what I'm talking about. I'm just going to put a name to a lot of these things, and almost codify it and give it some structure, rather than I'm going to be like blowing people's minds with science. So the way that we can start to think about bodybuilding from this perspective, labeling, is when we put a label onto something, it begins to have a meaning. So we're seeing this in a minute in terms of the race riots. I mean, I don't want to get into these issues too much, but when we label someone with a specific race, that engenders some people to think about that race in a certain way, even though they don't know that person.
Yeah.
Very simple idea. And this obviously happens in relation to drugs.
Yeah.
And it obviously happens in relation to bodybuilding. And people are labeled a bodybuilder. And when someone hears that, that means something to someone. Just the same as drug user. We'll talk about what specific drugs, but in everyone's head, that means something.
Yeah.
So labeling theory is this kind of very simple notion. And I like to kind of link it to this notion of the self-fulfilling prophecy as well. If I'm labeled as something by someone, I take that in a lot of the time as well. I take that in and then I perform that way. One of the ways that I learned this at university is, if you start to assume that one of the lads in my class is a bit of a tearaway, and then you treat them like that, guess what? That's how they end up behaving. So you label them in that way, and then they end up fulfilling that prophecy. So in relation to kind of drugs and sport, and actually where I've published on this is in relation to drugs and boxing, actually the absence of drugs in low-level boxing, amateur boxing. But
by drugs, in relation to performance-enhancing drugs, or
I'm now talking about, sorry, I'll probably need to clarify some of those terms at different times, but I have done one piece of research on drug use in sport, and largely shown that there's very little drug use in amateur boxing, and there's kind of obvious reasons for that if you think about the amateur nature of it. Anyway, talk about that a bit. But in terms of where a lot of this work is done, it's not really in bodybuilding. As you know, with the nutrition side and the supplementation side, who researches bodybuilders? I mean, they're weirdos, right? They're an odd sample. There's not many people who are bothered about that sort of thing. Yeah. And you don't get any money for it. The research is on diabetics or people with cancer and things like that. And it's the same within sociology of sport and sociology more broadly.
And not quickly, but that reference is something that we've discussed with Dean and we discussed with Ben the other week, in that bodybuilders at the moment love to look for studies on things. And the studies are very rarely done on a group of people that are relevant to us. Yeah. People will use a study on 60-year-old men with low testosterone and relate that to 18-year-old lads that are going to the gym. And there's not always a direct carryover.
No. And that's one of the reasons why we need critical thinking more as well. But where there is a lot of work which does have a good overlap is in sport and drugs. Because we all know, some people try and hide it, but sport is rife with drugs. Simple as that. The higher you go, the more drugs there are. So there's a lot of work on that, and there's a lot of ways of understanding it. And one of the guys, just a quick name drop, because I'm by no means an expert in this area, but Paul Dimio up at University of Stirling. He's the man for, if other people want to get into this and know a little bit about sports and drugs, he's the man there for that. So when we start to think about labeling, we can think about two other key terms: deviance and stigma. So we know, the word deviance, it means something straight away. You're a deviant, oh, you're bad. It really, in sociology, social theory, it's not so much that we think about that as good or bad. It's just that people deviate from the norm. So if this forget, you're just doing audio. I'd do a bell curve, and in the bell curve, the normal is in the middle of the bell curve, and then the deviant is at either ends of that. Yeah. So when we can kind of think about that, instead of thinking of a judgment, we can think about that as just a description of where people sit on that bell curve. So deviance theory helps us to do that. It's not a value judgment. But what we can think about in that way is that bodybuilders are relatively deviant in terms of the behaviors that they do and the things that they do. Athletes, in many senses, just a bog standard normal athlete. And I talk this about with my students all the time. You know, we have 400 odd students every year at Trent, and you get them to stand up at the beginning of the course, and you ask them about certain behaviors, which any normal person would think is ridiculous. Yeah. You know, training with an injury, like when you're injured, carrying on training. Why would you do that? Like coming back from an injury early. You know, starving yourself to make weight. What? These sort of things, which become so normal to us, are actually normalized within that subculture, but actually quite deviant in terms of the grand scheme of human behaviors on the whole. So what that means, though, is that we end up with this situation where people can be stigmatized because of the things that they do, because they're not, quote unquote, in the normal. Then we have to think what that means. This is where this kind of notion of bodybuilders and drug users, broadly speaking, but specifically PD users here, I guess, and to a certain extent, supplement users. I remember telling people when I was taking creatine, I've taken creatine for 15, 20 years. Yeah. And they were like, what? Like,
but there is now a study that shows that creatine is a gateway compound. So
there you go. We did talk about that as well. Yeah. But this kind of notion of deviance and like stigmatizing people, what does that mean? So everyone can follow along with that kind of idea, because I'm sure that anyone who's spent time in a gym doing bicep curls has been told that they're an obed and, you know, stigmatized for doing it.
But is that correlation or causation? Are they in the gym doing bicep curls because they're an obed?
Maybe. But what this is, what we can really get into is what this means for people who are in that subculture. Yeah. So what it tends to mean is that group, my partner is faffing around in the background. So we've got a dog issue, now a partner issue. What it tends to mean is that we end up with this idea of let's go straight to the nitty-gritty. People who are using drugs, and especially people who are abusing drugs. If they're in a world where they're stigmatized, who can they speak to? Who can they go and find knowledge from? And we know who it usually is. It's Big Bob, who's, you know, massive at the gym, the biggest guy or the leanest guy or whatever. You know, not an expert. Whereas if you think about it from a different perspective, a different drug, for example, one that's not stigmatized, like booze.
Yeah.
You know, like if I want to have a chat with somebody about how much I drink and have an open conversation about that, that's not an issue.
Yeah.
And if I say, I could do with drinking a bit less, can you help me? That's a fine conversation to be had.
Yeah.
Another way of thinking about it is performance enhancing in music. You know, think about all of the best albums over the last 60 years, almost all of them fueled by a mixture of cocaine, heroin, and acid.
And that's why they're so good.
Well, it's the performance enhancing. It helps people reach a different level of the creative process.
Yeah,
but those people aren't stigmatized. They're not stigmatized, are they? Like the lead singer of the Beach Boys, Brian Harvey, did acid for years. Just acid every day, and we all know about who's the guy. Osborne, Ozzy Osborne.
Yeah.
Anyone wants to like learn about acid taking, just listen to what Ozzy Osborne did. Now he's obviously messed himself up, but the point is, these conversations are very different with different drugs in different places.
Sure.
And what we know is that if drugs are legalized, liberalized, one like there is in certain countries and different communities. Good evidence for that, especially Portugal. Portugal's a good example. One, the usage tends to go down, especially the abusive usage, but also the education goes up. What we have in this subculture that we're talking about, just to kind of pull it back to bodybuilding, is a real absence of good knowledge. Now, your podcast, people like Dave Crossland, some of the really good coaches out there, are providing that knowledge, but you have to really seek it out. It's not like you can go to your doctor and say, right, I'm going to do steroids. What's the best stack?
Yeah. So here's a question for you
Yes.
around stigma and steroids, because it came up the other day for me. I asserted to my father, who is, he's not that old, he's 50, and he's not that old fashioned. He's a bit old fashioned with regards to kind of the current popular topics of the world. But I was talking about steroids, and he was you could tell he was a little bit uncomfortable. And I said, oh, what's the matter? It's not a big deal anymore. And he said that maybe it doesn't seem like a big deal to you because you're around it all the time. I genuinely felt like it's something that people are more comfortable talking about now. And he is of the opinion that that's just because of the environment I find myself in. Yeah. Would you say from someone who's in a different environment?
Right, yeah, he's perfectly right. He's nailed it. That's right.
It's unusual that you're right.
Yeah, it doesn't mean to say that he's right in that it is weird. It means to say that he's right in that you're embedded in a subculture which normalizes it.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things
makes
that
it normal.
He's never been one of those blokes that tell me what I should and shouldn't do, or not that I've listened. But he just doesn't want to talk about it. You do what you want. I don't really want to know.
Yeah. That's how older people deal with these things, especially because, as we know, fundamentally, older people, pardon me, are going to struggle as society shifts. The older they get, society shifts more, moves away from what they experienced as normal. And what we grow up in is usually what we stay thinking is normal for most of our life, unless we kind of think and reflexive about that. But let me just finish that point off, and then we'll move on a little bit.
Yeah.
What we end up with is what Lee Monahan, I think at Ulster, and he's written a paper on this, which is a good paper. And there's actually very few I would understand as really good papers on bodybuilding strength sports for a few reasons, usually connected to academics not being the sort of people that do well in that sort of subculture. You know, let's be fair, most academics are nerds by definition, they have to be. Yeah. And most nerds don't want to go and lift loads of weights. And I'm being mean, I'm being overgeneralizing, but there's an evident truth in also what I'm saying. It's a bit harsh. I'll probably get a backlash for that.
But Dean will comment at some point.
It's fine. Yeah. So anyway, Lee Monahan talks about ethno knowledge, basically knowledge within a group.
Sure.
And that knowledge can be fantastic. It can be really good. What we might call, what my PhD students work on at the minute, talking about expert lay knowledge. And what I talk about in terms of some of my work on concussion, how boxers understand concussion really, really well with no medical knowledge whatsoever, because they live it and they know when they're in trouble and they can do different things to manage it. Is that healthy? Not necessarily, but their knowledge can be really detailed. Is it medical knowledge? No. Is it scientific knowledge? No, but it can still be expert knowledge. So, however, it opens the door for gurus, for bro science, for the biggest guy in the room is always right sort of knowledge, which is fundamentally problematic. It gives us problems with critical thinking. It lacks the education which can go with it. So, for example, most people, when you listen to a lot of podcasts, they want to know, what drugs should I take?
Yeah.
And they want that to be a milligram amount or something over a course of weeks, not what's the process by which I figure out what are the right drugs for what I want to achieve.
Yeah. I mean, the correct answer is quite often, it depends. And people think
it always depends, right? There's no perfect whatever. So anyway,
cop out.
Yes. Well, to a degree, on social media where these things are answered, it's very difficult to give that kind of detailed information. Yeah. That's where the coaches come in. But broadly speaking, what the point I'm trying to make is that because this stuff is stigmatized, because it's subcultural and it's in these tight little groups and no one dares talk outside of these groups about it, yes, that's changing, but it's still not something that people talk about a lot. That knowledge stays very insular and it stays within that space. And if you're powerful in that space, and by powerful, I mean like basically the biggest, who can lift the most, maybe even the most shredded, or now with social media, the one who looks the best. So that could be genetic. Yeah. So like some dude who just has to look. What did I hear somebody say the other day? I think it was Broderick Chavez. Oh no, it might have been on your podcast, actually. Somebody just has to look at a car phrase machine and their traps grow.
Well, it was Ben talking about
that was on your podcast.
Yeah, and I know the backstory with that because I used to chat with Ben lots and lots when him and Luke were trained together. And like even on the subject of drugs, Ben will be quite happy with saying Ben used to take far, far more drugs than Luke ever took to just barely keep up. Yeah.
So, but the point is that if someone has those genetic kind of gifts,
they're
people just follow them. Yeah, they don't have to have good knowledge, one, but two, they might have perfect knowledge. They might be genetically gifted and brainily gifted and nail it, but they invariably aren't. Again, Broderick Chavez, you hear him talk about Ronnie Coleman. He's very mean about Ronnie Coleman's intelligence. But he's the man, right? He's the guy. So anyway,
the genetic testing on Ronnie Coleman.
No.
So he literally has every single gene expression you can have for building muscle, and every single gene expression for losing fat, as well as like a myostatin deficiency. Like he was bred to be massive. Yeah. And the rumor is that he's pro-natural, and it's been corroborated by quite a few people that he didn't know what steroids were until he got his pro card, and then the guys were like, what are you doing? And he wasn't doing anything.
Wow. So anyway, those sort of people can and do, especially on social media, not Ronnie Coleman, but insert social media influencer here. Yeah. And they can say what they like, and people are like, oh my God, you look so good, you must be right.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, to be fair, there's people, and my gym's a classic one. There's personal trainers in there who are absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
And they look the part and they get clients. And then there's personal trainers in there who have battled, like I have, and most people have battled with trying to stay in shape, trying to not get injured, trying to not be fat, trying to be a bit bigger all your life.
Yeah.
They're the people that know stuff because they've had to educate themselves to do it. Yeah. Anyway, the point then though is that this opens up these spaces for a lack of critical thinking, lack of really good knowledge, and also for people to not really understand stuff about health and well-being and all that sort of stuff, which, as we've talked a few times, and as Strom is a good example of, only more recently have people started to really think about health, and health also and performance, health enabling performance, but also health after you finish and just, I want to be big, but I want to live as long as I can as well, sort of thing.
I think
those ideas have flourished recently.
Bodybuilders are inherently very, very self-involved, selfish people. And I say that as someone who was a bodybuilder. When I was a bodybuilder, I was definitely more selfish and more self-involved. And it stands to reason that those people are going to be the kind of people that are going to be particularly keen on not dying. So when they're finished with the bodybuilding, they're going to go, fuck, I might have fucked up here. I need to fix that. So a proactive approach, I think originally a proactive approach was about that, but actually people have started to realize that a healthier body is a better performing body, is a better growing body. And even things like your liver values being out of whack. 10 years ago, we didn't have the facility to do blood work every month and see how things like your liver value, your liver not being efficient might affect muscle protein synthesis. We haven't got the studies on that yet, but we can certainly anecdotally say, well, when people's blood work is closer to normal range, they seem to respond better to inputs.
Yeah. But all that sort of stuff has to fight its way into these little subcultures.
Oh, yeah. Massively.
People are labeled in certain ways. So that's kind of like that kind of opening kind of gambit as to where some of that fits. And that helps us to understand the subculture, which can then help us to understand what becomes normal. So this is kind of moving on to the next idea. This notion of normal, I think, is really interesting. Really interesting for COVID at the minute. Really interesting for Brexit and a lot of these things. What is normal? How is normal produced over time? Who thinks what's normal in what space and what is abnormal in a different space?
Yeah.
One of the examples I give for this is, what I haven't mentioned is that at one point when I was studying at Loughborough, I trained and worked at Powerbase. Lots of people will know Powerbase. While I was in there, I was also doing some research in a boxing gym. A bodybuilding gym, proper spit and sawdust bodybuilding gym. And I heard people talking. I was a little bit out of it. I didn't really understand. One other thing. I was also young enough to be going out a lot. Okay. And I was in these 3 different subcultures. And I'd hear people talking about gear, and gear. And I was always hearing this word gear.
And there were 3 different things.
3 different gears. Now, you can probably guess what I'm talking about. When I was going out, it was cocaine. That was gear. When I was in the spit and sawdust bodybuilding gym, it was steroids, etc. When I was in Powerbase, it was lifting gear.
Yeah.
So it was more about where those bench vests are.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So and then what was interesting was that same word, 3 different subcultures. And because I was doing research at the time, I asked people about what they thought about gear.
Yeah.
So if you were out, I wasn't doing research in the outness, but I'd ask people anyway, what do you think about gear? They'd be like, yeah, well, cocaine's wicked. And I'd be like, what do you think about steroids? Like, well, steroids are horrific. I'd never do that. Yeah. And then you'd be in the gym and you'd say to a bodybuilder, what do you think about gear? And it'd be like, well, yeah, I need steroids. Yeah. And I'd be like, what about cocaine? But oh, well, yeah, it's not so bad. And then you ask him about lifting gear, and he'd be like, no, that's for, I was going to say something mean. That's for weak people. That's for weak people. Yeah. So the point there is, what becomes normal in different subcultural spaces really we interact with that notion of what's normal. We make it even what's normal. But also from one different space to another, we look at each other's different normals and we think they're all weird. Yeah. So from one gym, you're talking about gear and it's normal. The other gym talking about gear and it's normal, but when they meet, it's not. Yeah. This is that element again of labeling as well. Like one man's rubbish is one man's fortune. What's the phrase? It's the same with this in terms of drug use. Yeah. Some people will talk about certain drugs as horrific, the worst thing in the world ever. And then some people will talk about that same drug and be like, yeah, it's not that bad. One thing that I mentioned to you is in this notion of insulin. Yeah. That when you were talking to, is it Ben?
Ben, yeah. Insulin and DMP are the 2 that even among users that are experienced, people will turn around and go, holy fuck, that shit will kill you. And the answer is that anything will kill you if you don't know what you're doing, I guess. And actually, both of those drugs do have a risk element, but if you know what you're doing, they shouldn't.
Yeah. Same as paracetamol, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you want to kill yourself with paracetamol, you can. But insulin is whenever I've heard people talking about this, I've heard, consistent drug takers, I'd never touch that because you'll kill yourself. Yeah. It's one of the most, if you actually think about the physiology of it, it's one of the most light touch drugs. How would you describe it? One of the most light touches you could do. I mean, in terms of long-term effects, as long as you stay fit and healthy, you do your cardio, it's not going to touch the side.
There's even information around if you were to use a small amount of insulin when you're very much in your off season, improving insulin sensitivity by taking strain off the beta cells of your pancreas and improving insulin sensitivity, kind of in the same way that a GDA would. I think one of the problems with insulin is that the 90s protocols, I don't know if you've ever looked them up, I sent you some books the other day. The 90s protocols, they were things like, they were like the hyper massive protocol and stuff like that. And they'd involve you shooting like 40 IU of insulin around a training session while you drink a crazy concoction of various carbohydrates and stuff. And that's the kind of stuff where people can find themselves in a bad place. But the slightly more thinking approach that people take now really shouldn't cause any problems. I guess it's just tools and jobs.
Well, the key is it's not the drug, it's the lack of knowledge.
Yeah.
So then we go back to what I was talking about earlier. With these little subcultures, if there's no knowledge, there's no like understanding, there's no like, you just get told by Big Bob to do loads of insulin, and then you take his dose and you're effed. Like, okay, well, I'm not doing that again. Whereas if these things were spoken about, talked about, normalized as something, you could have open conversations with people about it.
Yeah.
Issues wouldn't be there. Andrew, I was talking to you, I mentioned this earlier as well. Andrew Triana, in a podcast with Broderick Chavez and Alex Keekle, he was basically saying, especially with athletes, this is the first thing they should be doing. They shouldn't be doing steroids. They should be doing insulin to help them train themselves to work harder, to get the carbohydrates in.
What kind of athletes does he work with primarily?
Say again?
What kind of athletes does he work with primarily?
Oh, I'm not sure. I probably a mix.
I can certainly see an argument for it.
Yeah, the point isn't whether he's right or wrong. The more point is, he's critically considered that, and he's not gone with insulin's bad. He's gone, right, let's understand the physiology here. Let's figure this through. Well, actually, it makes some sense. So I guess the kind of overarching point is to kind of be able to kind of think through what these normalized terms are, and to think through what that means, and be able to not just go, all right, well, that's bad because I've heard that word before. So this is this notion of what becomes normal. One of the key elements here that my work fits into is performance ideologies. Performance is normal. Focus on performance. Everything's got to be about performance. I must perform better. If I don't perform better, I'm worthless. That is basically the principle of elite sport. Consistently perform better until you win everything. And if anything gets in your way of that, smack it away and perform better. Now, there's a lot to be said for that. There's a lot to be said for performing better just in life more broadly. But a complete focus, if that's the only thing that's normal, the only thing in your little cultural space is normal to be 100% about performance, what does that mean? Well, it means thinking about health is not normal. Balancing that kind of performance element is not normal by considering it in its relation to health. What you can also do when you think about this notion of normal and deviance again, if I think it's normal to focus on health, and this is what happens a lot in sports teams, normal to focus on performance, and I want to get better because I'm in the second team, I want to be in the first team, well, I better focus on performance some more. And what then we turn to is what classic piece of work that I always rely on. And if anybody wants any of this stuff, I mean, I can't send them books, but I'll happily send them papers. Classic piece of work by Hughes and Coakley about the sports ethic. It's not ethics, it's sports ethic. And what they talk about in that is what's normal in sport, elite sport. And then what happens if you over-conform to that, i.e. do more of it.
Right.
So an over-conforming athlete is someone who realizes they've got to perform more. So turns up to training early, stays afterwards, goes home, had some food, does some more training before bed, wakes up the next day, bit tired, goes for a road run, etc., until they run themselves into a hole. Now I add drugs into the mix. If I want to get better, drugs have helped. Best do some more drugs. And you very quickly, if you're only focusing on performance, which we know a lot of people do, or physique or whatever, you're only like, my physique has got to be better. That's still focus on performance, not just lifting better, but I've got to get bigger guns. If you consistently focus on that and you add drugs into the mix, you're not only overtraining, but you're doing all of the stuff that can be really damaging with drugs. Now, as you know, I'm relatively I'm pro drugs in a variety of ways. Yeah. But I'm not pro abuse of drugs. Sure. And that's where people get into the problem. I want a liberalization of almost all drugs. There's some clarification on that, but almost all drugs want to be liberalized. But because there are some issues with, like you say, DMP and heroin and a couple of other bits of box, but we don't get into the details. Largely speaking, I think drugs should be legal, because then that becomes able to be educated about and talked about. Then this notion of over-conforming to it and doing more of what you think is good to get these performance benefits in a subculture which doesn't talk about health can start to be eroded. So that's where we kind of think about these kind of notions of over-conformity. Where I've done the most work on this is on concussion, really, is on boxers, young boxers especially, taking hits to the head and knowing they've got to keep going. And what happens if you keep getting hit to the head? It's so simple. But if you've constantly been told as a young boy, especially young boys, I mean, I know we've got to be very careful here. But the sports we're talking about are dominated by young boys and men.
Yeah. Yeah, don't worry about the NPC on our podcast. It's
no, I do, because I've edited a book on women in combat sports. So I do have to be slightly careful, but and I'll explain in a second. But let's stay with the boys for a minute, and then I'll unpick sexism in a second. You're being constantly taught as a young boy, which happens. You've got to do better. You've got to achieve. You've got to be strong. You've got to be able to look after yourself. Then you go into a boxing gym. You're primed to be pushed by that coach. In the wrong coach's hands, these malleable young people will push and push and push and push and push. Then they get a little bit of success. Now they're the boxer that's good. Now you've got to keep going. Now you've got to keep going. You probably sack school off a little bit. Now you've got to keep going more because you've got to make success out of boxing. And this is how people can end up in real problems. And it's exactly the same process for bodybuilding. Yeah. It's no different. Keep pushing, keep pushing. Oh, people are saying I've got bigger. Well, I'll do a bit more then. Yeah. That's where we get into this problem. Now, just to unpick my sexism slightly, these spaces are dominated by men still. They're codified by men. They have been. When women come into those spaces, they largely conform to the male way of doing it. Yeah. This is one of the problems where we get into kind of masculinity theory, which we'll talk about in a bit as well, and why masculinity theory is deficient in some of these areas. But largely, you find now that this is problematic, is that women are coming into these spaces and having to conform to the way that dudes do stuff and men do stuff, and it's damaging to men, it's damaging to women, it's horrific for everyone. So we're kind of bringing about equality by having women into boxing gyms, which is great, but it's equality in getting concussion. Right, yeah. Is that something we need equality in?
Well, you have it in everything, because that's the rule.
Well, exactly. And then the same with bodybuilding. Far more, I assume, you know much better than me, I am speaking out of turn here, but I'm assuming there's far more drug use in women's elite bodybuilding than there ever was.
I don't know. Maybe just talking about more. There's certainly more in the amateur level. There's certainly more in the amateur level. Certainly more at local shows, and there's certainly more with women that are maybe competing at like a bikini level that really shouldn't need it. At the top,
I had a dissertation student this year do stuff on CrossFit. I mean, that place is rife, right? Yeah. And it might not be like the really abusive stuff, but clenbuterol and whatever else, and those guys are doing quite a lot. So, and that crosses over to the women quite a lot, I think.
But so the women's one's funny because I think women now talk about it. I think when I started, it was like super, like to even ask a woman if they use anything was really taboo.
Right.
And people are more open about it now. The big thing with the women's stuff is that there's a huge amount of bad advice out there, and I suppose just like with boxing, if something's damaging to a man with a female, it could be much worse. If a female takes bad advice and she takes something like testosterone that virilizes, those changes are permanent. It's not like when a man does a bad cycle and they have some anxiety issues or they don't sleep for a little while or whatever. It's a permanent issue for a female, and I think it's a completely different topic that's interesting. And I need to cover it with a female because that covers me. Like if I want to talk about Black Lives Matter, I need to do it with Zach, my athlete, on here, so I don't get in trouble. I think what happens with a lot of the women is they end up going down a path where they cause themselves a lot of virilization and changes in their body. And then they have to take ownership of that and say, oh, that's what I wanted. Because otherwise they'll feel perhaps quite bad about it. And I've spoken to women that have said that that's what's happened. They've been pushed down that road by coaches or boyfriends, and then once they've kind of started down that road, you're committed, so you might as well crack the fuck up.
And what you've just done there is a classic sociological analysis. That is, here's a social norm, I've taken it on board, oh, something's happened, it's now a part of my identity, I've got to keep going, and I've got to keep pushing. And again, you get yourself into a hole, don't you? This is now me. My identity is surrounded by this. One of the things I have a problem with students at university, our university students, well, brutal statement. If you're at university, 99.9% of the time, you're not going to make it in any sport because you're already at university.
Yeah.
I say that to them. They hate me for it. 18-year-olds, week one, you're failures. You have failed at sport, right? And it's just to get them to realize that sport is about chewing up young bodies and smashing them out, and they're already done. Point is, what was my point? The point is that when you kind of start to understand that that's the premise of sport, if you attach your identity to that and nothing else, not education, and you go down that route, and then you have a bad injury, your ACL blows or whatever, what have you got left?
Yeah.
And I say this to them. I'm like, look, you know, you're not athletes. Yes, I know you love playing sport. Of course you love playing sport. We all love playing sport. We're here to study. And do not let your identity be attached to the second division foosball team that you play in or whatever you do at university. And they do. They get obsessed with it, even low-level university sport. And they sacrifice their degrees at times. Not completely, it's straight out the window, but I've known students who have really struggled because they've got so embedded in sports subcultures rather than their education. Anyway, it grabs hold of you.
Bodybuilding, though, there are bodybuilders that lose jobs and relationships
there you go.
for a sport that they're never going to be any more than mediocre at. Because the guys who aren't going to be mediocre at it don't have to sacrifice for it. Not that they don't have to sacrifice, they have to work, but if you have to push that hard that you're having to throw your life away for it, it's not going to happen for you. You know, as discussed, some people, it just works for them. It's a sport where everyone likes everything to be fair. Society has to be fair and everything has to be equal. Unfortunately, you can't equalize everyone's genetics.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. So we touched a little bit on kind of men and male dominance of these spaces. I've written on that. I've written a paper called about the male preserve, the preserve of sport as one of the last bastions of male dominance and power. But that leads us into masculinity theory, which is something I wanted to talk about a little bit as well. Largely because I have a fundamental problem with masculinity theory. I think a lot of it is really naff. The sociology of masculinity is really, really naff.
Is there an overview you maybe don't know?
Yeah, I'll give you a quick overview. So I mean, a simple way of understanding it is men's identities as men. People who identify as men as they understand themselves as men. What does that mean? Should a man be strong, maybe aggressive at times, powerful, stoic, all that sort of stuff?
Yes.
Now, we already know that there's very many different ways of being a man. You can identify as a man who's not aggressive, still masculinity. But there is this notion of a kind of a dominant masculinity, which we can kind of draw a picture of. If I ask my students to draw a picture of that, they can do that. He's usually got big muscles, might have tattoos, for example, or a skinhead. So we can kind of think about it. So there's two things here. One is the early work on masculinity in sport was relatively good. It's quite simple. It was relatively good. And showed that if people really, again, over-conformed to these notions of what a man should and shouldn't do, that can lead to lots and lots and lots and lots of problems in sport. And you hear it whenever you watch stuff, some of these old documentaries about the NHL players or the NFL players who got hooked on the aggressive players and then got hooked on painkillers, because they had to keep going. A lot of that, when you hear them talking, there's these undertones of masculinity in there. You know, this is what I have to do. This is how I protect my family. Those sort of ideas. Yeah. So some of the early work was really, really useful. But what's tended to happen, and as these terms have become more embedded in kind of normal society, everyone's heard toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
Can't stand that for different reasons. But as these terms have become more embedded as a kind of normal part of discourse in like day-to-day language, they've been reduced of the academic complexity and the nuance of the academic arguments, and also more broadly, the actual data that stuff's based on. So what people tend to do is go, "Oh, that's masculinity," and use stereotypes. Let me give you a good example. Go again back to my power-based days. Because I worked in power-based, as I said, and I worked with Rich Ellis, who on Instagram is Big Bench RE. I think.
I know that name. I might be a customer.
He works with Jordan Peters.
Oh, okay.
He's one of Jordan's athletes. He probably has. I know he recommended your joint to me. Oh, okay. Even though I was already taking it when I talked about my dodgy knees. Yeah. So he does know of your stuff. But anyway, Rich, I was studying and working in there, and I'd hear the undergrads, as I was an undergrad, I'd hear the undergrads talk about him because he worked in Power Base with me, and they wouldn't know that I necessarily knew him. He'll hate me for talking about this, but they called him King Base, as in he's the king of Power Base. King
Base. I thought you meant in terms of base.
No.
Different thing.
So this would be accompanied with clearly an assumption that Rich Ellis is, because he's fucking massive.
Yeah.
He's massive, and he's one of the strongest dudes he's the strongest dude I've ever met by a long way.
Me.
Yes. This is accompanied by an assumption, a lot of assumptions about what Rich Ellis is.
Sure.
He's scary, he's powerful, he's this like just this ogre who dominates power base. Now, I knew Rich Ellis, and most people who know Rich Ellis will say exactly the same as me. He's one of the nicest, caringest, calmest, kindest people you'll ever be lucky enough to meet.
Yeah.
But these people see Rich Ellis, label him using masculinity, label him using size and muscle as something. Then that gets passed around the university, and all of a sudden, King Base is someone to be feared.
Yeah.
Like if I have a question about supplements, come to you. If I have a question about training, I go to him.
Yeah.
He's always there to chat with. We always have a great conversation. So my point there is this lack between these social theories and social ideas and actual data and evidence. And a lot of the stuff around all of these things that we've talked about, whether it's bodybuilding, powerlifting, now masculinity, is based on a lot of assumptions by academics. And you've seen it. I've sent you some work where you've read it and you're like, why are they saying that if they've never been in a gym? And sometimes they have not been in a gym. How many pieces of research I've seen done with surveys about supplement use.
Yeah.
And then inferred that all these people are doing all this stuff. It's like, well, hold on. Have you asked them? Have you watched them? Have you seen whether they're actually doing this as how they say it, or are they doing something else? Or I guess it leads on to the kind of way in which I've done my research, which is getting into these spaces and living in them. That's why I took up boxing. Going and living with them, living with the people in those spaces and talking to them and finding out about them and observing them over a long period of time, what I call immersive research.
Yeah.
So one other bit of that, just to link in, is that book that I sent you, Hoberman. What's the title again? Mortal Engines.
Yeah.
So John Hoberman, he's written a book, Mortal Engines. He's also done Darwin's Athletes, both great books. You could probably find, if anyone's interested in some of this stuff, probably find them on Amazon for relatively cheap. But also a cracker called Testosterone Dreams.
Yeah.
And in it, he talks about testosterone having a folklore. Now, when I was in one of the boxing gyms, we'd knock her out with, sorry, I just touched my headphones now, sorry. Bodybuilding lads. So we'd be like relatively lean and fast and fit. And then the bodybuilding lads, 20 stone Goliaths would come in and boxers. It was fucking, it was loads of fun, hilarious. Because of that, some of the lads started to get some knowledge about hormones.
Yeah.
Specifically testosterone.
Yeah.
And this is going to link back to masculinity theory in a minute. When I used to ask these lads about why they boxed, why they enjoyed boxing, in effect, beating each other up, why the hell do we like beating each other up? A lot of their answers would draw back on, it's testosterone. And literally, I've had someone say to me, it's testosterone and that. Or genes. It's in your genes, youth. I've had people say to me, these are published quotes in, say again?
It's testosterone and that.
Yeah, and that.
Okay,
as in, and all the other stuff that I don't understand. Now, a biologist will be listening to this and they'll go, yeah, but there is an element of testosterone being that.
Yeah.
Okay, there might be. Do these lads in the gym who, even if I'm being kind, don't have the best education in the world, do these lads know what their testosterone levels are? No. When you ask them about what the difference between men and women are, it's, well, lads are testosterone and women are estrogen. Yeah. Not knowing the complexities of the cascadal system and all that sort of stuff. We don't need to get into that, I'm sure. Dr. Dean can go into that far more better than me. But the point is not whether they're right or wrong. The point is the association of testosterone to something uniquely male.
Yeah.
Something about aggression or whatever, without any knowledge whatsoever of what's happening in their bodies.
Yeah.
No knowledge whatsoever. But use an explanation. It justifies those behaviors.
Yeah.
So what I do is I go in, I had to learn how to be aggressive in boxing. So I've always been relatively anti-violent, never really punched anyone until I started boxing. I had to learn to punch people hard. I could punch people, but I could never punch them hard.
Yeah.
It took me 10 years to learn how to try and knock someone out. Literally 10 years of boxing to be aggressive enough to unlearn that I should never be aggressive. Now, that's got nothing to do with testosterone. To stop being weak and to throw a punch like I properly mean it to try and hurt someone.
Yeah.
10 years to learn that. Eventually I learned it.
But some people don't have to learn that, do they? Some people just know that.
No. And maybe they learned that when they were younger, whatever. Maybe it is a testosterone element. The point is, as Hoberman says, there's a hormonal folklore attached to testosterone, which justifies, it becomes normal. Oh, men have testosterone, therefore. And then the therefore is followed by behaviors. and you list your behaviours.
Yeah.
Punching someone, slapping my wife. You know, I've heard data of that. Oh, I lost it. I'd been training and my testosterone was high. Poof.
Yeah.
That sort of idea. I've never heard that quote actually, but I've had this person I'm talking about explain hitting his wife due to these issues.
Yeah.
That sort of idea, again, it's this normal idea. And if there's this normal idea that there's something uniquely male in testosterone and that all of us have got it,
yeah,
then it becomes one, deviant to not do it.
Yeah.
Why are you behaving like that? But also justifiable, legitimate. If it's justifiable and legitimate to do things because of the notion of testosterone made me do it, well, then you can learn it.
Yeah.
Then in certain subcultures, you can be encouraged for it. And then you do it more. And now we start to kind of let's link back to bodybuilding and whatnot. Same sort of thing here. People start to identify in certain ways. They get encouraged with that, these stories that we tell ourselves, whether it's hormonal or not, justifications for things. You can take that on board, you can live into it and you can grow into it and you get rewarded by it and it keeps going and it keeps going. And it's these kind of cycles, which, as you started out with the podcast, make us do some of the stupid stuff that we do.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good way to kind of like link some of those ideas in terms of testosterone. That's actually, if anybody wants it, in a paper called, well, it's got biology ideology in it, that we can have biological thinking as ideological. So if anybody wants that, just drop me an email. So yeah, one other point before we move on, and we may have to wrap up, you have to tell me, but that sort of depth of data doesn't come from a survey, right? Yeah. That comes from being in a gym with a bunch of meatheads for ages.
Yeah, you can't just go in and get it in a week. You've got to become that click to be given that information.
Yeah. And this is where my kind of, if I'm known for anything in kind of academia, which I'm probably not, this is my contribution, is that sort of like getting into those spaces. Now, you set it up earlier. Yes, I've got tattoos. I, up until recently, had a skinhead. I've got a lockdown crap haircut now that I've done myself. But I can fit into those spaces. I've got the accent that fits. I look relatively athletic. I can get away with looking a little bit sporty.
Yeah.
I can jump up and down. I can do things. I can hold my own in those spaces.
But the reason I mentioned that, I suppose, is because of the way people operate. If I said that you're Dr. Christopher Matthews, they can't see a picture of you. I know there's a picture on the podcast artwork. And I introduced you as Professor of Sociology. There's this instant mental image that comes with like a sweater with elbow patches and so on. And a large portion of people go, well, I can't relate to him. He hasn't got a fucking clue about what.
Yeah. But by having that kind of, it's a strength and a weakness, obviously. But by having that, it enables you to get into
academics.
Say again?
I'm sure it causes you problems with other academics.
Not so much academics, just walking down the street. But what that means is, and why this is kind of useful for us to understand, is that it helps me get into those subcultures we've been talking about, helps me be accepted in those subcultures. Now, other people can get into those in different ways. Another one of our mentors, Kath Woodward, she spent a lot of time in a boxing gym. You can tell by the name that she's not a normal person who goes into a boxing gym, because just by nature of being a woman, not many women go into boxing gyms. She at the time was an older woman, but she was accepted in a different way. So you can get into these subcultures in a different way. She was accepted as someone to be caring and looked after some of the fighters. Yeah, exactly. It can happen, but it's on a different set of terms often. My PhD student at the minute, she is a Muslim woman, kickboxer.
Right, okay.
Gets into the subcultures in really interesting, different ways to me. Draws on some of the stuff that I do. She has far more fights than me. But obviously has difficulties in different ways as well. Just basic access to the boys' changing rooms. You know what I mean? But she can get different data. Anyway, I guess what I'm getting at is that a lot of the stuff that we know in these sort of areas is this kind of survey stuff, this assumption stuff. Oh, all those lads are doing drugs because of their masculinity. It's toxic or something. What?
Yeah.
Do we know? No. Well, let's go and find out. Let's go and ask them. And let's just not ask them with a survey. Let's go and get into that gym and spend a year with them and see at the end of that. Yes, there's going to be one horrible, nasty meathead in there who conforms to every single stereotype you've ever met. Most of them aren't. Most of them are going to be just nice dudes.
Yeah.
And they're going to be doing whatever they're doing for whatever reasons. And it's not usually the obvious one. They might want to be a bit leaner, yeah. They might want to be a bit bigger. There might be some element of personal pride in that. That's not the whole story. It's usually because they love lifting weights. They like the consistency. There's a lot more complexity to it.
In terms of the people I've been dealing with on the day-to-day, I used to deal with a lot of young kids, and we talked about before, when I first really launched Strom, I put a lot of effort into my appearance. I was a lot bigger, a lot more muscular, and I would get lots of young lads that would come to me that wanted to. I had people come in the shop and say stuff like, "I want to be about your size," that kind of thing.
Yeah.
What I find now is I get lots of people coming to me that are in their late 30s, early 40s, they're starting to realise that they need to put some time into themselves, and that there's lots of things that they can do, and they want to speak to someone who they don't perceive as a meathead, I guess.
Right.
And I think I give them someone that's accessible to talk to. But it's quite a dramatic shift. I'm sure there were guys in that age range doing it before, but there seems to be a big spike in it at the moment.
Yeah.
Again, whether that's a social acceptability thing or I don't know. I don't know why it is. It might be more my image has changed than.
Yeah, and I think with those sort of issues around, all I want to do with those sort of conversations is for people to understand that to get to really know somebody is a real good part of research, and to get to know the motivations for people. You can do some stuff with survey research. It gets a lot of numbers back. It gets a lot of people in. Some stuff in the lab. You can't get to know someone, and getting to know someone is our most unique human research method. It's the thing that we do. It's how we live our lives. That's basically what my research is. It's a formalization, a systemization of how we get to know people in a general sense. A lot of that though is it's qualitative research. This is not the stuff that people are like, there's a study that proves that. But it's really, really useful. As some of the stuff that we've just sketched over a load of stuff. There's modules and modules and modules that we deliver on this sort of stuff at university. And when I'm on a sports science degree, so imagine what the sociology degree is like.
Yeah.
And the depth of stuff that you get into this, when you start to kind of realize already inbuilt in us as human beings is an ability to understand each other and communicate with each other.
Yeah.
That can and should be a fundamental part of research, especially if you want to know some of these issues like we've talked about. Why do people do stupid things that we do?
You just mentioned about university, and I think it's something that would be quite interesting. It's something that I'm personally interested in. You mentioned at the start about why should people still look at traditional academia when there's so many tools out there for self-learning? I think that's a really interesting topic. Something that I think my subculture very much now dismisses.
Yeah, and it's becoming obviously a hot topic because our students coming in this year with COVID are going to get far less what we might call face time. So what does that mean? What are they paying for now? They're paying for these kind of long distance lectures or something. And people are kind of seeing that as some sort of problem. I don't think it is at all. We don't need to get into that too much. Simply to say the value of a distance learning degree should be as good as one where you're there every day. Should be. Whether it is or not is university and course dependent. I will say as well, in our degree program, we have such a good team, young team, that our distance learning, the bits of it that we'll do will be amazing. Anyway, but the actual point, and I'm glad you asked me because I did want to talk about this. The point of what is the point of university education, and the money that's attached to it. I was lucky enough to get through my studies before the big fee hike came up. I was one of those $4,000 a year sort of students rather than this $9,000 a year. And I was also lucky enough to work through university. So that's something that people should be looking at. But you're right. There's a lot of people. In fact, most of the people, sorry, let me reframe that. There's a lot of people who know a lot, very good knowledge without any formal higher education in bodybuilding. Very, very good. And they have proved the ability to self-educate is there. But those people are relatively unique in their work ethic and in their mental capacities, I think. Yeah. What we specialize in at university still, this will not change. Not change in my lifetime. What we specialize in and do better than anyone else is give people a well-rounded general knowledge in the first year. So specifically on our sports science degree, we have 4 different degrees connected. 450 students will have this year come in. And the first year, for all of those students on the different degrees, is always the same. They get a knowledge of physiology, psychology, biomechanics, nutrition, sociology, some of the bits and bobs as well, sport business. Get all of that general knowledge at 18. When for the most people, your brain at 18 isn't ready for much. Mine wasn't. I didn't start studying properly until I was mid-20s. And at that point, I was still a child.
I had a business.
I still am now, basically. Yeah. So the point is, once you've got that baseline, second year, third year, you move into these more specific modules, you start to develop it, you start to have modules that you select, choice modules, and you start to kind of drive your interest levels. When you finish that program, you have an overarching understanding of, for me, sports science. What does that mean? All of those different topics that I talked about. That means that although I'm an expert in sociology, if me and you talk about physiology, I can hold my own with you. We can discuss these things relatively simply because I have a good basis of it. If I watch podcasts from the muscle mentors and they're talking about biomechanics, I'm like, yeah, I understand all those levers and all that sort of stuff. And I communicate in that language, no problem whatsoever. If you're involved in sport and you want that baseline knowledge, to get that is very hard on your own.
Yeah. You
can get specific. So you can disappear down rabbit holes about growth hormone and you can nail it. And you can be the foremost expert in growth hormone. You ain't got a clue about what a lever length is. My point is, in the world that we're increasingly in, yes, you need to have that specialized element and you can get that on your own. And actually, universities don't really give that. They do in the dissertation, but you have to go and get it yourself through the dissertation process. But what universities give is this real deep, all-round knowledge, which then you can apply to whatever you want to apply it to. If you want to be in sport, you want to be personal trainer, you want to be an online coach, you want to do whatever you want to do in sport, those degrees still have a lot of legitimacy. And also, you're driven to do work. You have to do work. There's no like, oh, I'm not motivated to do this. Well, all right, see ya.
Yeah.
You'll fail. So you've got to do it. So there's a real legitimacy there still. And one other point, in the world we're currently in, who knows where we're going to be in 3 years' time?
Yeah.
It's all, someone's just like picked the world up, chucked it in the air and smacked it with a baseball bat. And we've got to let everything settle. One of the best places to be for 3 years is in a university.
Skiving off.
Working diligently under someone like me.
You might correct me here. One of the things that I think going to universities should give you, particularly in like a sports field, and if you're interested in the kind of stuff we talk about, is the ability to look at studies and research things yourself and actually understand them.
Yes.
What I see a lot of on social media now is people being told, go do your own research, and then people will go off. In the worst case, they'll go and read an article on tea nutrition or something, and they think that's doing research. But in a somewhat better scenario, they'll go and read published medical studies, they'll go and read university papers, but they'll cherry pick or they'll see the data they want to see in them. They'll take what they want to take from them. And that is a constant source of frustration because you will get messages from people who think that they've worked it all out that haven't got a fucking clue. Because understanding the way in which these things are written is a skill. It's a skill that I'm still working on. It's a skill that I hope to improve on over the next couple of years. But it is a skill that you need to learn. And I think university gives you a good background in doing that. Yeah,
you basically get your handheld through that. Whereas doing it without your handheld is a nightmare. To try and figure out where you start on PubMed. Everyone talks about PubMed. I never use PubMed. It's ridiculous. Yeah. Anyway, point is, you need that kind of basis. You need to understand what science is. You need to understand that one paper, doesn't change the world. You need to understand. Come here. You need to understand where these bits of the puzzle fit in with other disciplines. To think of all that sort of stuff. Don't worry about the nuances of growth hormone until you understand the Krebs cycle. Yeah. You know what I mean? There's no papers written about the Krebs cycle. That's in a textbook. Go to a goddamn textbook and read the textbook. That's how you get that kind of base knowledge. That's the same as all the things with bodybuilding. It's the same as with training. It's the same as with nutrition. People worry about carb timing and their folate split when they don't know how many calories they're eating. Yes. So that's where that fits in. Now, do you have to do it by university? Of course not. Do we churn out a lot of good students and real solid foundations, which they can then develop if they want? If they don't want and they want to be a bit lazy and just phone it in, fair enough. If you want that grounding, especially at 18, when I don't think you're ready for the real world yet, personally, I wasn't. Might be different for some people, but then the university education still is there. It's a problem because of the cost. I don't think anyone should pay for university, but we do. So that's I'm quite old-fashioned.
not old-fashioned. I used to read a lot of old books, so I read a lot of kind of like turn of the century stuff, and it was always drilled into those kind of books that going to university was a thing only for the privileged few.
Right.
And that's not the thing anymore, is it?
No, certainly not. It does then lead, though, to problems whereby people who probably shouldn't go to university think they should. People who would be far better suited to going and getting a job, being entrepreneurial, or some sort of, a lot of my friends went to university. Say again?
Placing of items on a shelf.
Possibly. But a lot of my friends who spent a lot of time at university have dropped out of whatever they were doing with that course and have started working with their hands. You know what I mean? A mate of mine is completely happy, loving life, works on an estate, managing the estate. He was a pharmacist.
Yeah.
So these people shouldn't necessarily go, but we assume that they should. Yeah. Critical thinking again, considering where you want to go and what you want to do. But
I've got lots of friends that went to university and say I've never been. I hope to, but it was something that was never really on the table for me because of my what's the term? Economic socio standing at the time. It wasn't viable.
Fair enough. Yeah.
But yeah, it's certainly interesting. It's something that there's a lot of confusion around these days. So the last thing I think we wanted to touch on, and correct me if I'm wrong, was your private services.
Oh, good. Yeah. A little bit. Yeah, it's a straight up plug, really.
Yeah, well, that's
I have plugged the university, so I think that's good. And one other point on the university, we actually, I'm an external examiner at 2 different universities. I've been an external examiner at 2 other different universities. That means I go in and look at their courses and stuff. And I've worked at other universities, got friends all over the country. The Nottingham Trent Sports Science degree is one of the best in the country, without a doubt. If someone is actually considering this sort of area, young, old, whatever, Nottingham Trent is a really, really good place to do it. We nail our support of students because we're one of those smaller universities. I mean, we're actually quite big now because we have traditionally been.
So for you were going to say you nail your students. Should not be.
No, we certainly don't do that. No. Anyway, so enough of that plug-in. Gosh. I also have a immersive research consultation company business. So the idea there is all of this sort of stuff that I've talked about, this way of understanding the world from quote unquote the inside, getting into it. 2 real ways that I kind of try and help people there is, one, go into businesses and try and say, look, how can I be in this business with you for a bit and give you some kind of knowledge based on your staff experiences, customer experiences, that sort of stuff, generating insights. The other one is going into businesses and doing talks not undissimilar to this, workshops on critical thinking, on research methods, on, one of the main things is that I've seen so much crap research done for companies using surveys, and the surveys are designed to elicit a certain answer, and it's a complete waste of time. And I want to be, and what people do is they think, oh, we'll get this market research company because they'll do it for 500 quid. The university have quoted 50 grand. So clearly we'll do it for 500 quid. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to kind of find a middle ground, which is we can do this more nuanced work and we can do it in different ways, sometimes stripped back, which enable the financial side to be more appropriate. So that's immersiveresearch.co.uk. And that's also the place where all my research is, which is free to download. And if anyone wants to contact me, you can contact me through there to get the other stuff that I've talked about. Most of the stuff that I talked about at the beginning was books in terms of Hoagman, but when there's papers and stuff, or if anyone wants to have a conversation about any of this stuff, then that's the way to try and pick me up. So that's a nice little plug. Thanks for that.
No, you're right. I will try and pop a link to the website in the description if we can. You can also get in touch with Dr. Matthews via Twitter, as apparently he still uses that. He tells me that other academics use it. I don't think they do, but apparently that's the way to do it. Or you can look at dogs on his Instagram.
Yeah, basically. So the Twitter is Dr. CR Matthews. So it's short for Dr. Christopher R. Matthews. I have to use my R because there's another Christopher Matthews. There's a few of them. So Dr. CR Matthews. Yeah, and Instagram, because obviously you've now tweeted me Instagrammed me, whatever that is. And I've now got some followers on Instagram from you. Yeah. And they're just going to get cheese, port, beer, dogs, and cigars.
I see no problem with that whatsoever.
Well, if they're into that, they can follow away. But they're not going to get any science, that's for sure.
Well, you could
rather talk about
the modern world.
Pardon?
You could transition over into the modern world and kind of do a bit of that on Instagram as well.
Yeah.
Or is
you
it
have to do, if you're going to do social media. Say again.
Is it too lowbrow for academics? Is that the problem?
No. It's just that if you're going to do social media, you have to do it properly. And I've always been quite loose on social media, and I'm trying to up my game on on Twitter, and like not put spelling mistakes into stuff and to tweet stuff that makes some sense. So to try and then do that on another platform at the same time is probably just a little bit too much for me.
Right.
Considering as well, academics don't need social media. We need to be in a classroom teaching and publish some research. Our life is relatively, if you want it to be, untouched by social media still. Yeah, there's some high flyers who go and do this and that and the other, but you don't need to. You can just do what I do and kind of like flow under the radar.
All the weird seminars and stuff that kick off now kind of spawn from, it seems to be, or certainly within our little clique.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
People like Martin McDonald have done phenomenally well.
Martin's another person who was at Loughborough. So there's all these people, and I'm sure there's a lad from Muscle Mentors who was at Loughborough and I was there. I don't know his name. And you mentioned
Josh Melee.
Josh earlier. Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of us who. Say again.
Something in the water at Loughborough, DBOT or whatever.
Yeah, well, everyone knows about Loughborough and its kind of connection to sports science and sport more broadly. But there's a whole bunch that were in Power Base for that time, and Jordan Peters as well. Yeah. Who were there? Who I'm not involved in this subculture like all those are. As names and whatever. Yeah. But I see them all, and I'm like, I'm sure we might train together at some point.
Yeah.
It's funny watching Martin. He's hilarious. I've known Martin for years.
Yeah.
Such a good guy. And the kind of the following he's built and the online identity is ridiculous.
I've only met him properly once at a Body Power after party, and he was drunk, and he was talking with someone about nutrition, and I gave my opinion, and he went, "Yeah, but you're a juice bomb."
There you go.
And at the time, I was probably about the biggest that I've been. But that's kind of been my lasting impression of him. And I'm sure that's not representative of him. I'm sure he's not a good man.
No, he's a good guy, Martin. But he'll call it as he sees it. He wasn't wrong, right?
Well, I mean, he wasn't wrong. But I can't remember what the topic was. I just remember that I sulked for the rest of the night because I like him and Phil Lerney. They've both got a way. Like they could talk about the science of paint drying, and then it would be listenable. Yeah.
He's got a very good presence. It's good to have watched him grow over the last few years as well, because I've seen that develop. He's always a very good guy and always very switched on, but he's shifted a few gears up, so that's nice to see. Anyway,
on that note, we will leave it at that. Dr. Matthews' website is again something research. I don't know.
Immersiveresearch.co.uk.
That's what I said.
I think.
And this has been a bit of a change of pace from normal. So any feedback, any questions, shoot them over to us, because we are getting into the habit of doing follow-up episodes 5 or 10 episodes later, where we will look at a more specific topic in detail. Thank you very much, Dr. Matthews, and I will speak to you soon.